The air in Prospects Hollow on October 3rd, 1883, carried the first undeniable threat of winter. It was not the gentle chill of autumn, but a sharp, crystalline cold that seemed to emanate from the very marrow of the mountains. It clung to the low-hanging mist in the valley and made the simple act of drawing breath a conscious, painful effort. The aspens, which only a week prior had been a riot of gold, were now skeletal, their leaves stripped away by a premature, biting wind. The old-timers, men who measured their lives in the severity of winters past, felt it in their joints and spoke of it in hushed tones over lukewarm coffee at Abernathy's General Store. They spoke of the widow's winter of '68, the year of blue snow in '75. They prophesied that this coming season would earn its own grim name. Alara Vance felt the cold not in her bones, but in her solitude. At 19 years of age, she was a widow, her husband, Daniel, having been taken by a logging accident the previous spring. Before that, she was an orphan, her parents lost to a fever when she was a child. She lived on a small, 30-acre claim at the northern edge of the settlement, a place Daniel had bought with the dream of starting a family. Now, it was just Alara, a small cabin, a sturdy barn, and the livestock within, 2 milk cows, a handful of chickens, and Daniel's aging mule, named Moses. The cabin was small, built of pine logs chinked with mud and moss, and the barn stood a full 75 feet away, a journey that was trivial in July but could become a lethal expedition in January. She was an outsider, not by choice, but by circumstance. The women of the town pitied her with a detached sort of sympathy, offering casseroles and quilts but keeping a careful distance, as if her string of tragedies might be contagious. The men, leaders of the small, self-reliant community, saw her as a problem to be managed. They saw a young woman alone, a property that would surely fail, a burden waiting to fall upon the town's charity. They offered advice she did not ask for and made assumptions about her capabilities she quietly resented. Their counsel was always the same: sell the claim, move into town, and find work as a laundress or a seamstress. Find another husband. They saw her resilience as stubbornness, her silence as ignorance. On the morning of October 4th, with the frost on her window pane thick as milk glass, Alara made a decision. She did not come to it lightly. It was born of nights spent listening to the wind howl like a famished wolf around the eaves of her cabin, and of days spent calculating her resources. She had a finite supply of firewood, stacked neatly against the southern wall of the cabin. She had hay and grain in the barn for the animals. The critical vulnerability, the weak link in the chain of her survival, was the 75 feet of open, exposed ground that separated her shelter from her livelihood. In a true Dakota blizzard, a whiteout where the world vanished into a swirling vortex of snow and ice, that distance could become infinite. People had died in their own yards, lost and disoriented, mere feet from their front doors. The solution came not from her own ingenuity, but from the ghost of her grandfather. He had been a mining engineer in the mountains of Colorado, a man who understood the earth not as a surface upon which to live, but as a medium with which to work. He had taught her about geology, about pressure and load-bearing structures, and about the one great, immutable principle of the deep earth, its constancy. He left her his books and journals, filled with meticulous diagrams and notes written in a precise, elegant hand. In one of these journals, bound in cracked leather and smelling of dust and time, she found it. It was a chapter titled, "On Subterranean Passages and Thermal Regulation." Her grandfather had written about using the planet's own thermal mass to create stable, protected environments. The ground, he explained, just a few feet below the frost line, maintains a remarkably consistent temperature, insulated by the Earth itself from the wild, violent swings of the surface climate. He called it harnessing the deep warmth. Alara spent the entire day rereading the chapter, cross-referencing diagrams and committing the principles to memory. The plan that formed in her mind was audacious, unorthodox, and, to her, perfectly logical. She would not try to fight the winter on its own terms, battling it for every cord of wood and shovelful of snow. She would go under it. She would dig a tunnel, a subterranean corridor connecting the root cellar of her cabin to the foundation of her barn. It would be a project of immense labor, a solitary, back-breaking endeavor. But the logic was unassailable. Once completed, the 75-foot journey would become a safe, indoor passage, impervious to the wind, the snow, and the lethal cold. She could tend her animals, retrieve supplies, and live without the daily, gnawing fear of being trapped and isolated. The next day, she took inventory of her tools. She had a good spade, a sturdy pickaxe, 2 buckets, and a wheelbarrow with a slightly wobbly wheel. It was not enough. The project would require lumber for shoring, more robust digging implements, and lanterns for working in the dark. She took the small cache of money Daniel had left her, a total of $47 in silver coins kept in a tin box, and hitched Moses to the small buckboard. The journey into the center of Prospects Hollow was cold, the air so sharp it felt like breathing powdered glass. Abernathy's general store was the heart of the town, a place of commerce, gossip, and unofficial civic governance. When Alara walked in, the usual trio of town elders was gathered around the pot-bellied stove. There was Mr. Abernathy himself, a portly man whose generosity in extending credit was directly proportional to his delight in public opinion. With him sat Thomas Croft, the blacksmith, a man of immense physical strength and equally immense intellectual rigidity. And completing the circle was Jedediah Miller, the most prosperous farmer in the valley, a man who believed his success was proof of his superior wisdom in all matters. They greeted her with the familiar, patronizing kindness she had come to expect. "Miss Vance," Abernathy said, nodding his head. "A cold one, is it not? You ought to be home, close to the fire." "I need some supplies, Mr. Abernathy," Alara stated, her voice even and clear. She did not waste time with pleasantries. She handed him a list she had carefully prepared. 3 new shovel heads, the reinforced kind, another pickaxe, 20 yards of thick hemp rope, 6 lanterns, and 10 gallons of oil. And I need to order lumber, pine boards, 4x4s and 6x6s. I have the dimensions and quantities written down. Abernathy scanned the list, his eyebrows climbing his forehead. Croft and Miller leaned in, their curiosity piqued. This was far more than the usual order for a lone woman heading into winter. This was a construction project. "My word, child," Abernathy chuckled, a wheezing sound. "What are you planning on building out there? A fortress?" Thomas Croft took the list from Abernathy's hand. He was a man who understood materials, and he grunted as he read. "This is enough timber to frame a new shed. Heavy beams, too. What for?" Alara met their gazes without flinching. She knew this moment would come, and she had resolved not to be cowed by it. "I am digging a tunnel," she said plainly. "It will connect my cellar to the barn. The lumber is for the shoring." A silence fell over the store, thick and immediate. It was broken only by the crackle of the fire in the stove. Then Jedediah Miller let out a short, barking laugh. "A tunnel? Did she say a tunnel?" Abernathy took the list back, a look of genuine disbelief on his face. He looked at Alara as a doctor might look at a patient suffering from a peculiar delusion. "A tunnel? In the ground? Child, what on earth for?" "To get to the barn in the winter," Alara explained, keeping her tone matter-of-fact. "When the snow is deep and the wind is high, it will provide a safe, warm passage. The earth below the frost line maintains a stable temperature." Thomas Croft, the blacksmith, shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion of profound disagreement. "That's the craziest thing I've ever heard. You'll be digging in frozen ground inside of a month. The walls will cave in. You'll flood it come the spring thaw. It's nonsense. A woman's fancy." He said the last 2 words with a finality that was meant to end the discussion. "The ground is not yet frozen deep," Alara countered, her voice remaining steady. "I will dig to a depth of 6 feet, which is below the frost line in this region. I will shore it properly with timber framing every 4 feet, just as it is done in a mine shaft. And I will dig a slight downward gradient from the cabin to the barn, with a sump pit and drainage channel at the far end to handle any seepage. It is all based on sound engineering principles." Her confident, technical explanation only seemed to amuse them more. Jedediah Miller slapped his knee. "Engineering principles! Listen to her! Been reading some dime store novel, have you, Miss Vance? Your husband, God rest him, built a fine cabin, but he didn't fill your head with this sort of foolishness. You need to focus on practical things. Salting your meat, mending your clothes, not digging holes in the ground like a badger." "The total cost for these materials," Abernathy said, scribbling figures on a notepad and pointedly ignoring her explanation, "comes to $27.40. That is a considerable sum. Are you certain you wish to waste good money on this project?" "I am certain," Alara said, placing a small cloth pouch of silver coins on the counter. She counted out the exact amount. "I will need the lumber delivered tomorrow." As she left the store, their voices followed her, no longer trying to hide their derision. "A tunnel! The poor girl's grief has turned her mind. She'll give up after the first day of blisters." Someone ought to talk some sense into her before she hurts herself. Alara did not look back. Their laughter was a cold wind at her back, but it did not touch her. It was the predictable noise of a world that feared what it did not understand. Her grandfather's journal was filled with stories of men just like them, men who had mocked new ideas until disaster proved them wrong. Their skepticism was not a barrier, it was fuel. The work began on October 7th, 1883. The day was overcast and cold, the sky the color of lead. Alara stood in the dusty, cramped space of her root cellar, a small chamber dug into the earth beneath her kitchen, accessible by a heavy trapdoor. It was here that the tunnel would begin. She lit 2 lanterns, their yellow glow pushing back the subterranean dark and casting long dancing shadows on the stone walls. She had marked her starting point with chalk, a rectangle on the northern cellar wall, 4 feet wide and 6 feet high. The first swing of the pickaxe was a shock to her system. The impact vibrated up the hickory handle, through her arms, and into her shoulders. The wall was a dense, stubborn mixture of compacted soil and rock. For the first hour, her progress was measured in mere inches. It was grueling, monotonous work. The rhythm of it took over. Swing the pick, pry the loosened earth, shovel the debris into a bucket, fill the bucket, carry it up the cellar stairs, dump it in the wheelbarrow, wheel the barrow to the far side of the barn and empty it. Repeat. By the end of the first day, she had created a hollow barely 2 feet deep. Her hands were raw, her back ached with a fire she had never known, and a fine layer of dust coated her hair and clothes. She was exhausted, but she was not discouraged. She had begun. The next morning, the load of lumber arrived. The delivery man, a young man named Silas, unloaded the heavy beams and planks with a sympathetic look on his face. "Heard what you're building, ma'am," he said, avoiding her eyes. "Town's got a lot to say about it." "People will talk," Alara replied, signing the receipt. "Yes, ma'am." "Well, be careful," he said, and hurried away, as if embarrassed to be associated with her folly. The arrival of the timber marked a new phase of the project. Now, for every foot of tunnel she excavated, she had to construct and install a section of shoring. This was the methodical, precise work her grandfather's journal had described in such detail. She followed his instructions to the letter. Each frame consisted of 2 vertical 6x6 posts, a horizontal 6x6 cap beam across the top, and a 4x4 sill plate on the floor. She cut the timbers to size herself with a bucksaw, the blade singing its high, sharp song in the cold air. She learned to notch the joints, fitting the cap beam snugly onto the posts to create a strong, load-bearing structure. The first frame was the most difficult. It took her an entire day to cut, fit, and wrestle the heavy, awkward pieces into the small opening she had dug. She used a heavy mallet to hammer them into place, the percussive thuds echoing in the confined space. Once the frame was secure, she wedged planks behind it, holding back the raw earth. The process became her entire world. She would rise before dawn, eat a quick breakfast of oatmeal and coffee, and descend into the earth. She worked by lantern light, the air thick with the smell of damp soil and freshly cut pine. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the next swing of the pickaxe, the next shovelful of dirt, the next timber to be measured and cut. Days bled into one another, marked only by the slow, steady progress of the tunnel stretching out from her cellar. 4 feet, 8 feet, 12 feet. Each completed shored section was a small victory, a testament to her perseverance. She developed a deep, physical understanding of the earth. She learned the different textures of the soil, from the soft topsoil to the dense, clay-heavy subsoil, to the frustrating layers of shale that shattered under her pickaxe and had to be cleared piece by piece. The men from town made it a point to ride by her property occasionally. They would stop their wagons at the edge of her land and watch her, a small, solitary figure wrestling with heavy timbers or pushing a laden wheelbarrow. They would shake their heads, sometimes calling out to her. "Still at it, Ms. Vance," Jedediah Miller shouted one afternoon. "You'll hit bedrock soon, or maybe China." His companions laughed. Alara never stopped her work. She never gave them the satisfaction of a response. She simply continued, her movements economical and determined. Her silence seemed to bother them more than any argument could have. By the end of October, she was 25 feet in. The pile of excavated earth behind her barn had grown into a small hill. The physical toll was immense, but her body had hardened to the task. The blisters on her hands had become calluses. The ache in her back had subsided into a dull, constant tension. She had lost weight, but her arms and shoulders were stronger than they had ever been. She had also devised a more efficient system for removing the dirt. She laid 2 parallel planks along the floor of the completed tunnel, creating a track. She then fashioned a small, low-slung cart from a wooden crate and 4 small, cast-iron wheels she salvaged from an old piece of farm equipment. Now, instead of carrying individual buckets, she could load the cart with dirt, pull it back to the cellar with a rope, and use a simple pulley system she rigged to hoist the contents up and out. It was an innovation that saved her hours of labor each day. November arrived, and with it, the first snow. It was a light dusting, a mere whisper of what was to come, but it changed the landscape, blanketing the valley in a stark, silent white. The cold deepened. The ground at the surface became hard as iron, making her grateful for every inch she had already dug. Down in the tunnel, however, the temperature remained remarkably stable. It was cool, certainly, but it was a damp, cellar-like cool, free from the vicious, biting wind that now scoured the world above. She had reached a depth of 8 feet to ensure she was well below the frost line, and her grandfather's science was proving true. The earth was a blanket, a vast thermal battery. She was now more than halfway to the barn. The logistics became more complex. She had to run longer ropes for her cart, and the air in the tunnel grew stale. She addressed this by building a ventilation shaft. Midway along the tunnel's length, she painstakingly dug upwards, shoring the narrow shaft as she went, until she broke through to the surface. She capped it with a small shielded hood made of tin to keep out the snow, allowing fresh air to be drawn down into the tunnel as the warmer, stale air rose and escaped. It was another detail from the journal, another small application of forgotten wisdom. The final push came in the 3rd week of November. She had calculated the endpoint precisely, aiming for the northeast corner of the barn's foundation. The last few feet were excavated with a surgeon's care. She used a hand trowel, listening intently for any change in the sound and feel of the earth. Then she heard it, a dull thud. Her trowel had struck stone. It was the foundation of the barn. A wave of profound relief and satisfaction washed over her, so potent it almost brought her to her knees. She had done it. She had spanned the distance. Breaking through was a delicate operation. She carefully cleared the earth around the heavy foundation stones, then used a crowbar to painstakingly loosen and remove them, one by one, until she had created an opening large enough to pass through. She emerged into the familiar, comforting space of her barn, the air filled with the scent of hay and livestock. The cows looked at her with their placid, curious eyes, and Moses the mule let out a soft bray of greeting. For the first time in nearly 2 months, she stood in the barn without having had to step foot outside. The final stage of construction was the doors. They had to be strong, well-insulated, and tightly sealed to prevent drafts. At the cabin end, she built a heavy, double-planked door within the cellar itself. At the barn end, she constructed an equally robust door, insulating it with packed wool and covering it with a layer of canvas. She spent 2 days ensuring the fit was perfect, with no gaps for the cold to penetrate. She installed heavy iron hinges and a thick sliding bolt on each door. On December 1st, 1883, she declared the project complete. The total cost had been $27.40 for materials. The cost in labor was incalculable. The tunnel was 4 feet wide, 6 feet high, and 75 feet long. It was dark, smelling of earth and pine, but it was a sanctuary. The temperature inside hovered at a consistent 45 degrees Fahrenheit, a stark contrast to the single-digit temperatures that now gripped the valley. Walking its length was like moving through a different world, a quiet, protected space where the rage of winter could not reach. The town's derision had not abated. Her project, now complete, was dubbed Vance's Folly, or the Prairie Dog Hole. The sight of the ventilation hood in the middle of her yard and the large mound of earth behind her barn were sources of endless amusement. They did not understand the science, so they dismissed the result. Not one of them had asked to see the finished work. Not one of them had considered the logic behind it. They saw only the strange obsession of a grieving widow, and they waited for the winter to teach her the lesson they believed she so desperately needed to learn. The lesson came, but it was not for her. On the morning of December 18th, 1876, the sky took on a strange, bruised, yellowish-gray color. The air became unnaturally still, and the temperature plummeted. Alara, seeing the signs her grandfather had taught her to recognize, spent the day making her final preparations. She brought extra buckets of water into the cabin and the barn. She double-checked the latches on her doors and windows. She filled her lanterns and stacked a generous supply of firewood next to her stove. She moved through her tasks with a calm, unhurried efficiency. By midday, she had secured her small homestead. The cows were milked, the chickens fed. Everything was in its place. The blizzard arrived just before dusk. It did not begin with a gentle flurry of flakes, but with an onslaught, a sudden, violent explosion of wind and snow that descended upon the valley like a collapsing mountain. The world beyond her windows disappeared in an instant. It was not a storm. It was a physical erasure of reality. The wind was a living thing, a shrieking, malevolent entity that tore at the cabin, seeking any crack or weakness. The sound was a deafening, constant roar, a symphony of chaos that vibrated through the very logs of the walls. Inside, Alara was safe. The fire in her stove burned brightly, her cabin was warm, and the storm was a muffled roar outside her well-chinked walls. When it was time for the evening milking, she simply lit a lantern, unbolted the trap door to her cellar, and descended the stairs. She walked through her dark, silent tunnel, the air cool and still, a world away from the pandemonium above. In the barn, the animals were calm, insulated from the storm's fury. She milked the cows, fed the chickens, and gave Moses an extra ration of oats. She returned to her cabin with a pail of fresh, warm milk, not a single drop spilled, not a single snowflake on her coat. The journey had taken her less than 5 minutes. The storm raged for 2 days and 2 nights. The snow accumulated at an astonishing rate, driven by the relentless wind into massive drifts that reshaped the landscape. On the second day, Alara looked out her small kitchen window and saw nothing but a solid wall of white. The snow had buried her cabin up to the roofline. The outside world was gone. Yet her life continued with an almost surreal normalcy. She cooked her meals, read her grandfather's books, and tended her animals via the tunnel. The passage was her lifeline, the artery that connected the 2 vital organs of her homestead. On the morning of the 3rd day, December 21st, the wind finally subsided. The silence that followed was as profound and unsettling as the previous noise. Alara knew the worst of the storm had passed, but the true danger was only now beginning for others. The temperature, without the wind, had fallen to a level of cold that was actively hostile to life. She climbed the ladder to her cabin's small attic and pushed open a tiny shuttered window just below the peak of the roof. The sight that met her eyes was breathtaking and terrifying. The world was a sea of white. The snow was piled in drifts 15 to 20 feet high. The tops of fences had disappeared. The familiar shapes of trees were distorted into monstrous, snow-laden sculptures. Her own cabin and barn were little more than mounds of white, identifiable only by their roof peaks and the thin tendrils of smoke rising from her chimney. She scanned the valley, her eyes searching for signs of life from her neighbors. Abernathy's store, the blacksmith shop, the Miller farmhouse, all were entombed. She saw no smoke from their chimneys. A cold dread, far colder than the air, settled in her stomach. Their houses, unlike her small, low-profile cabin, had multiple doors and windows at ground level. Those doors would now be buried under tons of snow, packed and hardened by the wind into a substance as dense as ice. Their wood piles, invariably stacked outside, would be inaccessible. She knew what she had to do. There was no choice. Her anger at their mockery had long since faded, replaced by the grim reality of their shared humanity. Survival was a collective enterprise, whether they knew it or not. Her first challenge was getting out. Her cabin door was hopelessly buried. The barn, however, was a larger structure and had created a different pattern of snowdrift. More importantly, it had a hayloft door, a full 12 feet off the ground. She went through the tunnel to the barn. She climbed the ladder to the hayloft, carrying a shovel and a coil of rope. The loft door was blocked by a thick layer of snow, but it was high enough that the drift was not as compacted. She pushed against it with her shoulder. It groaned, then gave way, spilling a cascade of fine, powdery snow into the loft. She stepped out onto the surface of the new world. The snow was packed hard enough to walk on. She stood atop a 20-foot drift, the sun a pale, indifferent disk in a brilliant blue sky. The cold was shocking, a physical blow that stole the air from her lungs. She had to get to the Miller farm first. It was the closest, a quarter mile to the east. The journey was a nightmare. The surface of the snow was uneven, a landscape of frozen waves and sudden deep pockets of soft powder. Walking was exhausting, each step a struggle. She wore heavy wool trousers, a thick coat, and Daniel's old fur-lined hat. She wrapped a scarf around her face, leaving only a slit for her eyes. Within minutes, her eyelashes were frosted with ice from her own breath. When she reached the Miller farm, the scene was one of utter stillness. The two-story farmhouse was almost completely submerged. Only the top few feet of the second floor were visible. The chimney was dark. There was no sound, no sign of life. She struggled to the south side of the house, where the second-story windows were. They were caked with ice. She hammered on the glass with the handle of her shovel. "Hello, Miller, can you hear me?" she shouted, her voice sounding small and thin in the vast, silent landscape. For a long moment there was nothing. Then a shape appeared behind the frosted glass. A face. It was Jedediah Miller. His expression was one of stupefied disbelief. He fumbled with the window latch. It was frozen solid. Alara used the shovel head to smash a pane of glass. The cold air rushed into the house. "Miss Vance?" Miller's voice was a hoarse whisper. He was wrapped in every blanket he owned. Behind him, his wife and two small children were huddled together, their faces pale and pinched with cold. How did you get here?" "There is no time for that," Alara said, her words frosting in the air. "Your fire is out. You are freezing." "The woodpile is buried," he said, his voice cracking. "We cannot get out. The doors are blocked. We burned the last of the furniture this morning." Alara worked quickly. She tied one end of her rope to the window frame and lowered the other end. "Your children first," she commanded. Miller, his arrogance stripped away by the raw, primal fear of the cold, obeyed without question. He tied the rope around his young son and daughter, and Alara, bracing herself on the frozen snow, hauled them up and out of the house. His wife followed. Finally, Miller himself climbed out. They stood on the surface of the snow, shivering violently, staring at her as if she were an apparition. "My home is warm," she told them. "I have food. Follow me. Stay in my tracks." She led the dazed, stumbling family back across the frozen expanse. When they reached her property, she did not lead them to the buried cabin door. Instead, she led them to the barn, to the hayloft entrance she had cleared. They climbed down the ladder into the relative warmth of the barn. The cows greeted them with low moos. The Millers stared, bewildered. "But how will we get to the cabin?" Mr. Miller asked, his teeth chattering. Alara simply lit a lantern and led them to the corner of the barn. She slid back the heavy bolt on the thick wooden door and opened it, revealing the dark, sheltered maw of the tunnel. "This way," she said. She led them through the passage. As they stepped out of the wind and into the profound, earthy stillness of the tunnel, a collective gasp went through the family. The air was cool, but not cold. It was calm. It was safe. They walked the 75 feet in stunned silence. When Alara opened the door at the other end and they climbed the stairs into the warmth and light of her small, cozy kitchen, where a pot of soup was simmering on the stove, they looked as if they had been reborn into another world. Jedediah Miller looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a mixture of awe, shame, and profound gratitude. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He simply sank into a chair at her table, his body trembling with the first waves of returning warmth. There was no time to rest. Leaving the Miller family in the care of his wife, Alara took Jedediah with her. "Croft and Abernathy are next," she said. They took more rope and another shovel. The journey to the blacksmith's house was even more difficult, but with Miller to help break a trail, they made better time. They found the Croft family in a similar state, trapped on their second floor, their fire long dead. They rescued Thomas Croft, his wife, and their teenage son, and led them back through the snow, through the barn, and through Vance's Folly. Finally, they went for the Abernathys. The general store owner and his wife were old, and the cold had taken a greater toll on them. They were weak, barely able to move. Alara and the two men had to fashion a makeshift sled from a shattered door to pull Mr. Abernathy back to the cabin. By late afternoon, Alara's small home was crowded with the very people who had mocked her. 3 families, 11 people in total, were now safe within her walls, warmed by her fire, sustained by her food, and alive because of her foresight. The silence among them was thick with unspoken words. They sat huddled in her small living space, wrapped in her blankets, drinking her hot soup. Thomas Croft, the man who had called her plan a woman's fancy, could not meet her eyes. Mr. Abernathy, who had cautioned her against wasting her money, wept quietly in a corner. Jedediah Miller, who had laughed and told her she was digging to China, finally found his voice. He stood up, his body still weak, and faced her in front of everyone. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice heavy with emotion. I was wrong. I was a fool. A proud, Blind fool! He gestured around the warm, safe room. We laughed at you, we mocked you, and you saved us. This tunnel? He shook his head, unable to fully comprehend it. This folly of yours is a miracle. It is the only reason our children are alive today. Thomas Croft rose to his feet as well. He is right, the blacksmith said, his voice rough. I work with iron and steel. I thought I understood strength. I was wrong. What you have, Ms. Vance? The strength it took to do this, alone, while we all pointed and laughed. It is a strength I do not possess. I am in your debt. The storm, which would later be known as the Great White Ruin of 1883, had been catastrophic for Prospects Hollow. When the thaw finally came weeks later, the true toll was revealed. 7 other families, living on more isolated claims, had not survived. They had been trapped, just as the Millers and the Crofts had been, but there had been no one to save them. They had frozen in their homes, victims of a conventional wisdom that had failed them utterly. In the aftermath, Alara Vance was no longer the town outcast. She was its quiet, unassuming savior. The men who had led the chorus of ridicule now deferred to her judgment. They came to her not with condescending advice, but with respectful questions. They helped her clear the snow, repair the storm's damage, and replenish her supplies, refusing any payment. The tunnel, Vance's Folly, became a local legend, a testament not to foolishness, but to a wisdom that ran deeper than their own. They had looked at the world and seen only its surface. She had understood the strength and stability that lay just beneath. She had not changed. She was still the same quiet, methodical, resilient woman she had always been. But the world around her had been forced to change its perception of her. She had not sought their approval, but she had earned their respect in the most undeniable way possible. She had been vindicated not by words or arguments, but by the simple, irrefutable fact of survival.